All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into Twice the Size of Sun.
A very powerful collection of poems.
Yeah, it won the 2024 Penjishan Poetry Chapbook Prize.
It did, by MK Kuol.
That's right, MK Kuol. And we have both the ebook and the hard copy versions.
We do, which means we can really pull out the most important parts for you.
Yes, exactly. Give you a good overview.
Without overwhelming you.
Yeah. So, quick background, this chapbook comes from Nigeria.
It does.
Published by Poemify publishers. And this was just published April 2024.
Very recent.
The ebook ISBN is 979-8320-613932.
And the hard copy, 979-832-961-3933-04202.
There you go. You got it. Right off the bat, we see a dedication
Yes.
for Dangmakon Galang and Perskizinile in memoriam. And that right there, it hints at some of the themes that we see throughout the poems.
It does. Loss and remembrance.
Yeah.
Big themes.
Yeah. So just glancing at the table of contents, we see that the poems are labeled, they're organized.
Alphabetically.
That's right, A to
Yeah.
Z. And then there's a prologue, epilogue, and acknowledgments. So it seems very deliberate.
A structured journey.
Yes, exactly.
Almost like a narrative.
Yeah, yeah. So to frame our discussion, Kuol actually starts with a quote from Salman Rushdie.
It does.
And he says, "A poem cannot stop a bullet. A novel can't defuse a bomb, but we are not helpless. We can sing the truth and name the liars." And I think that's so powerful because right away he's positioning this idea of poetry and the poet, up against these very real and harsh, sometimes, realities.
Right. It's interesting that he starts with that because it makes you think about what kind of power poetry does have. If it can't stop a bullet, what can it do?
Right.
What is its power?
Exactly. It can speak truth to power.
Witness. Yeah.
Yeah. So the book also features a reviews section.
It does.
And McQuay Moses, he's a poet, editor, and essayist, had some thoughts about this collection.
Right. Some key takeaways.
Yeah.
What did he have to say?
Well, he said that the book vividly portrays, he uses the quote, "all the horrors of mankind and the scalding Mephistophelian nature of man, and then the suffering of the victims." He kind of sees the poet as this divine witness. He goes on to even compare, and this is kind of intense, he compares this book to Prometheus's elegy.
Wow.
And he says that he even intends to bring it to judge the gods.
Okay, so right there, that is pretty powerful. We've got, basically, what's the main takeaway there?
It's the intensity of the suffering and then the poet's role as this almost moral authority.
The observer, yeah, like an outsider looking in.
Yeah. And Sir Akwieme, he is also a poet, literary critic. He had some thoughts as well. He says that the book explores grief, war, hope, the human experience.
It's big topics.
Very big topics. He talks about familial grief, the essence of home, familial connections, and how Kuol blends personal narratives with these wider societal reflections. He also points out these, what he calls micro-narratives that oftentimes carry moral lessons. What's interesting is he also points out that Kuol is very versatile with his style. He uses both what Surkoi calls experimental and traditional forms of poetry. He sees hope as this kind of persistent undercurrent. And he even mentions, and I thought this was kind of cool, this lion-goat metaphor to describe human adaptability.
A lion-goat metaphor.
I know.
That sounds like a very interesting metaphor to unpack. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, well, basically he's saying that humans are adaptable, even in the face of hardship.
Okay, so there's a lot of different things here. Personal loss, societal issues, human resilience.
Right.
It sounds like.
Yeah, yeah. And he does mention that readers who might not be familiar with these more experimental forms, they might find it maybe a little bit challenging.
Okay, challenging in what way?
Well, when we say experimental in poetry, we're talking about kind of breaking away from the traditional structure, maybe playing around with line breaks and punctuation.
Right.
The way language is used.
Right. So if you're looking for a traditional sonnet, you might be a little confused.
Right. But he emphasizes that this is all part of the poet's commitment to pushing the boundaries of poetry. So it's important to keep that in mind. Before we even get to the poems, though, I want to point out these epigraphs.
Right.
And the epigraphs are really heavy, right? Tenny David, also known as T.G. Thonk, writes, "I am afraid, utterly afraid, for greed has gotten the guts to divide a whole against its own self."
Oh, that's heavy.
Right. So right away, you kind of see this theme of internal conflict, this, the destructive power of greed.
Yeah.
And then we have significant queer mopper who writes, "The other day, a family of 7 was murdered and no one uttered a word."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this is talking about silence in the face of tragedy.
Right. And it kind of maybe makes a comment on how we can become apathetic.
Exactly, exactly. Adutloy Akak asks this very pointed question, they say. Just hoot the horns of grief. If soldiers who fought still pray for sun to shine upon their frozen hearts, what are you rejoicing for?
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
So even if there is a victory, what is there to be happy about?
great, because the wounds of war is still there.
Right.
Yeah. Odu writes, and this one I found really, really powerful. Our country has outgrown prayers. Let's pray for ourselves instead. Let's fetch our brother's blood from dust and wear our cupped palms in solemnity as night descends upon us. Our country is a grave. And that, it just paints such a bleak picture,
Yeah.
of this nation overwhelmed by loss. And it's almost like this shift away from like traditional solace
Right.
to this more direct, almost confrontation with grief.
Right.
Yeah. And then we have TK Thon who says, very simply, they sold the cause and bought guns.
Oh, wow.
So this is talking about the betrayal of ideals.
Right. Putting power over principle.
Exactly, yeah. And then finally, Yamdeng Garang asks this heartbreaking question. They say, ended up me at ownless, penniless misery ascribed in the outline of my eyes. When will I go home anyway?
So sad.
I know. Right. So now we're down to the individual, the human cost of conflict.
Right, exactly. Displacement,
Yeah.
lack of belonging.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, these epigraphs, they just set a very heavy tone.
Yeah, we do.
For sure. Then we get to the prologue, and in the first part, Kuol actually very directly says that these poems, he says they're not masterpieces. He goes on to say that they are short stories about wars punctuated with scars lithographed on the souls of those who survived them. Barely.
Huh. Interesting. So he's kind of setting our expectations.
Right, yeah.
He's not promising us these perfectly crafted, poems. He's promising us something real.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that metaphor, the scars lithographed on the souls, that's so powerful.
It really is. It is. And then the second part of the prologue, he brings in this quote from Kalen Dion.
He does.
And Kalen Dion says, if you spend enough years in this world, you'll undeniably learn that grief endures. And then Kuol, he kind of echoes his earlier sentiment. He says that the poems are not masterpieces, but mannequins dressed to exhibit the apparel, our collective agony is, to you, the progeny, that you may with joy grieve, if you live long enough to know what grief is, if you live long enough to read them. Cognizant, grief has always been, will always be, the portion of all ever born.
So he's passing it on.
Exactly. He's passing it on to future generations. And it's this idea that it's not just personal. Grief is this universal experience.
Right, right. So let's look at some poems.
Okay, so poem A starts with this idea of writing, and he uses this phrase, rinse off grief. So it's almost ritualistic.
Oh, okay. So writing is the way to deal with this grief.
Yeah. And then he has this very powerful line, only the hurt knows a scar is a wound too, a heart's wound. And then there's this very poignant image of a mother seeing her child, and this is the last time she's going to see her child. But the world around her is urging her to see beauty. And the poem kind of ends with this question of whether poems, like men, are only embraced when they reek of pain. So you see this idea of grief, writing as this outlet,
Right.
but also this kind of messed up like idea that society only embraces art when it comes from suffering.
Okay, so he's commenting on the things that we value.
Right, exactly. Yeah, poem B takes us to this very specific place of displacement and loss. And he repeats these lines. Hear what's said is not heard. Hear what's shown is not seen. Hear what's found is not kept. Hear what's grown is not tended. So it's like this disorientation,
Right.
Nothing makes sense.
Yeah, nothing is as it should be.
Exactly. And then there's this idea that he kind of says that sophistication is a survival mechanism.
Okay.
And then he brings in this very powerful imagery. He describes a boy asking his gods to prostrate at his shadow. Another boy is described with skulls of shadows the night guzzled. And then there's this image, this discovery of thousands of squashed skulls and broken bones worm-licked to shine, telltales of what my country became after becoming a country. So it's very
disturbing,
but also telling.
very telling. Yes.
Right. So from this disorientation, we then see the results of this conflict,
Yeah.
and it's painted in such a vivid way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Poem C starts with this very direct statement,
Mhm.
and he says, "None of your names is an aptonym. a reflection of your character.
So it's this question of appearances, right? And then we have this idea of the mother's grief, which he describes as dumb grief, and then the father's kind of skepticism about heaven. And he even goes so far as to say that a servant in the eyes of God is just a slave.
Okay, so questioning kind of these structures,
Right.
religious structures, governmental structures, all of that.
Right, yeah. And then he ends with this very, very powerful metaphor. He says, almost all the poems written are scoundrels born when fraught hearts make out with empty stomachs.
Wow.
So it's this idea that, art can be born out of suffering and desperation.
Yeah, it's not always pretty.
Right, exactly. So poem D begins with this very vivid image of the sky emptying out.
Okay.
But the gutters are dry. And then he asks this question. He says, is suppressing your thoughts suicide?
Deep.
Yeah.
So is that like intellectual suicide?
Right. Exactly. And then there's this sense of miscommunication with his mother. He describes her as having a blank face. And then the father is described as a vowel lunging life into the veins of a language he doesn't even know he knows.
That's beautiful.
Right.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, but it's also sad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then a tutor, he gives this analogy about not giving up childbearing after losing a child. And then he has this, he's just screaming. He's screaming about language and identity. And he says this very powerful line, a man who has forgotten his language has forgotten himself. And then he talks about distorted mirrors.
So it's about who you see yourself as and how you were seen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he brings in a quote from someone named unflinching.
Okay.
And unflinching says that we ridicule imagination for immortality. And then Kuol says, well, what good is immortality when lifespans are so short anyway?
Right.
So it's this idea of like big ideas versus like the reality of your situation. And in the footnote, it says that unflinching Mathiang is a South Sudanese writer.
Okay.
So giving you that context,
Yeah.
Poem E starts with this quote from Noor Hindi, and Noor Hindi says, after Noor Hindi's fuck your lecture on craft, my people are dying.
Wow. Okay, so we're not messing around.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's this idea that like art for art's sake is not relevant when people are dying. So he talks about children seeking treasures in junkyards before their death.
Oh.
Yeah. He wishes that he was like the poets who care about the Nile, but he also feels complicit. And he says, I know I'm this regime because whenever I walk in, someone gets shot, something gets looted. And he says that poems about beauty are really for those who can still see, a good future. And he vows to gnaw on his conscience after death.
Wow.
And that he wants to write about women in a different way in the future.
So this is really interesting because he's wrestling with, like, what should poetry be about, right? Should it be about beauty? Should it be about suffering?
Yeah. And what is his role in all this?
Right.
Yeah.
Poem
F is a little different. He starts with this line. A man is an enigmatic poem about his deity serenades my intuition routinely. So it's almost a little more mystical. And he talks about a myth blossoming from a forlorn voice, guiding the sun home with a blistered tongue, and that he sometimes loses the way to his own heart. So it's a little more introspective.
Right. So he's looking within himself here.
Exactly, yeah. Poem G is very, very surreal.
Okay, buckle up.
Right.
Yeah.
So vivid imagery of God, angels, a wilting sable sun. And he has this dark-hued demon. And the demon says, there's no way a sky isn't a sonnet. Right. So very unexpected.
Yeah.
And then paradise is envisioned as the world without religious stains.
Oh.
And then there's this mention of Churchill and Hitler in Tartarus.
Okay.
So already we're like all over the place.
Yeah.
And then there's this very simple haiku, and it's condemning evil, but it's just, very concise. He talks about a search for fleeting existence on the margins of an angel scroll. The moon is falling into lost voices. A wise son seeking himself in his father's shadow, the scrambling for languages. The demon actually pleads with him to get rid of depictions. He says, who will cast you to the lake of fire? The poet is torturing his tongue for wisdom. A steaming angel is threatening him. And then the demon has this final thought. He says, why fear when poets are the eternal custodians of God's words? You'll only pass away when they pass away.
So much going on.
I know.
What is the main takeaway here?
It's this blurring of lines between good and evil, and then this power of poetry, to carry on.
Right. So it almost sounds like poetry is above it all.
Right. Yeah. It almost has this immortal quality. Yeah.
Yeah.
Poem Atia, he talks about a nocturnal sky, and he has this line: A nocturnal sky is a cryptic tale of a moon spitting stars. The sun swallowed whole professes a poem veined with a silence.
So he's talking about the night sky.
But he says only eyes can hear. And then he gives us these epitaphs on stars and dawns. And he says, at least a god dies the day a poet dies. So again, connecting these two. And then he says the sun is retreating to mother's womb for refuge.
Interesting.
Yeah. The sky is turning into an obnoxious boy. History is the foam of mist. A mystic says that gods will cease to be when the last poem ceases to be.
Wow.
And then heaven howls and strikes them with blindness.
Oh.
And that the poem itself is this crucifying inane lies.
Okay. That's a lot to unpack.
It's a lot.
What do you think that means?
Well, I think it's connecting the cosmos to poetry,
Okay.
to meaning and truth.
Yeah.
And this idea that poets are the guardians of truth.
Right. So very important.
Very, very important. Yeah. Poem I, we have this bold old boy, and he's going back to a burning barn, but not for safety. He's looking for a missing vowel in grief's byname. Yeah, and he just bypasses the speaker entirely. And when the speaker asks if he'll ever return, the wind responds, calls he death, calls he his, and whirled the ashes, all of him left.
Oh, wow. So powerful. What do you think that means?
Well, it's this idea that grief, it's so all-consuming, it drives you to do these kind of like desperate acts. You know, he's searching for this tiny little missing piece, and it's all that's left.
Yeah.
Poem J, it's like the aftermath of loss. He talks about the days after death being sunless, and that grief is leavening in frail hearts. And there's this lingering presence, this song inside a barn about those who have died. The father says, weed your voice, child. Who knows, death here might be birth there. So it's almost this very stoic approach.
Right. Like a different perspective.
Yeah, and then he describes plucking a silent syllable to premise a poem. And that the sun kind of flutters out and then blooms into this bloodless moon after her looming spook. So it's that immediate disorientation after death. Yeah.
And then trying to make sense of it.
Exactly. Poem K. Okay. Starts with this plea to a reluctant poet. He's saying, breathe the poem into life. And the poet questions, who are you even writing this for when the maimed are still tracing their scars?
Right.
And then he introduces this polyhistoric psalmist, and the psalmist sees demons as fallen angels and makes this kind of bold statement. He says, most of you are memos of dull sex. So very provocative.
Yeah, very provocative.
And then he brings in all these historical figures, Lumumba, Sarawiwa, Liang, all challenging oppressive forces or historical narratives. The footnotes explain who each of these people are. Lumumba was a Congolese independence leader. Sarawiwa was a Nigerian activist who was executed for his environmental advocacy. And Lo Liang is a Sudanese writer known for his very, very experimental style. And then we get these internal psalms. Home is a nightmare. It talks about the generational gap. The speaker feels like he's been, kind of predetermined. The father has very strict views. He describes grief as the ghost of lost love, and the father urges him to invest in trust. And then there's this image of a child in a half-buried skull singing about what war might rob. And there's this echo. As men are, so are their gods. And the psalmist cries out, doom! And ultimately, the poem itself wants to be written.
Wow. That sounds like a very heavy poem.
It's very heavy.
What do you think the takeaway is there?
It's about history.
Okay.
Faith, trauma, the act of writing, and all these are intertwined, all coming together.
Yeah. Poem LA hits hard with this prologue. My motherland died in my heart the day my mother died in her hands.
Oh, wow.
Right. So immediately you feel this grief. He talks about soldiers and women. There's this patriotic rant. And then the speaker kind of questions the whole idea of a motherland. He says, what is a motherland to a child it robbed of a mother anyway?
Right. So this disillusionment.
With nationhood.
Exactly. Yeah. Poem M is a Facebook poem, and he's talking about profaned constitutions.
Okay.
And a politician laments the shift away from Shakespeare and what he calls refined sentiments. And the speaker says, well, these are spontaneous confessions of a heart thoroughly hurt. And the politician ends by issuing a coppius.
A copyist.
Yeah, it's a warrant for arrest.
Okay.
So, the artist is being,
censored.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. Poem N is dedicated to Ajamoni Luknagor.
Okay.
And he talks about these wailers, a mourning mother leaning on a lean simile of homesick children, a perplexed father lamenting wilting streams, and the parents, they ask, what hope does a bereaved tree have? And he says the seraphim pause their praises, the earth swallows her, and he ends with this question. Who knew there'd come a day the sun would go to sleep, never to awake again?
So sad.
Yeah.
What's he getting at there?
Well, he's talking about profound grief, but even nature is mirroring this grief.
Right, so it's his cosmic grief.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Poem O begins with this prologue, and he says that it takes place after the Liberation War and after the Civil Wars.
Okay.
And the mother says, "Not yet, son." Sometimes the sun smiles while the clouds weep, and then, tragically, she dies that same evening
Oh, wow.
by war.
Okay.
And then a voice says, don't weep because she's found rest in death. And he describes his mother as a sad woman who would just shake her head at tales of five Sholmomong and Sixolsitku Akulti. The footnotes tell us that those are Dinka phrases for, like, troublesome times, and that the times have always been bad, but that now hope is a shy whisper drowning in the din of despair.
Wow.
So, the cyclical nature of violence.
And hope just disappearing.
Exactly. Poem P is dedicated to Amir Mayan Alir.
Okay.
And he says that this is the mother who is home.
Okay.
And he describes home as a mother giving a child sunshine even on rainy days.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and that now home is this faint taint of a sallow woman making ends meet in the moonlight who will die before her children awaken and demand flowers where only thorns grow.
So sad.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
It's interesting how he defines home, though.
Right. It's not a place. It's a person.
It's the mother.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Poem Q is this very, very long poem, very dense, and it's just this torrent of imagery. He talks about sin on an immaculate soul, a sacred cord that's been severed by ego, a broken covenant, a mother whose throat has been slit, child's heart crumbling, and then it's just this rapid fire of historical figures. Hitler, Churchill, Chi Min,
Okay.
Malcolm X, Lumumba, Che, Gandhi, Lincoln, Stalin, Mao, Elon Musk. And then he mentions a 1945 and a cloud twice the size of sun, a monument that was built in 2011. Mao says that a nation must be cannibalistic. Musk conquers Mars in 2029.
Yep.
Garang hacks his back to build ethnicity based on ethics. And then finally, this image of a starving man. And he says that his allegiance is to his stomach. So it's just this very chaotic poem.
Yeah.
And then he ends with this child asking how to escape this messed maze. And then a possessed poet kind of goes on this rant about Armageddon and auctioning air.
Wow.
And in the footnote, it says that cloud, twice the size of sun, is in reference to the atomic bombs.
Okay.
So this is connecting like individual suffering with these huge global forces.
Yeah, and these cycles of history.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Pomer R, he says it takes place in Hiroshima in 1945. And we see this couple that's just filled with hope.
Yeah.
They're longing for their wedding day. But then right before they say their vows, death arrives. And he describes it as being shipped in on the swift wings of America's ravenous ambitions.
Oh, wow.
And then it's just this very tragic scene.
Yeah.
The groom is left to bury his bride. And the poem ends with this lament, death indeed, destroyer of worlds indeed. And then he mentions Oppenheimer. So, it's this idea of this huge historical tragedy, but he's bringing it down to this very personal level.
Right, so you can feel the individual impact.
Exactly, yeah. Poem S is dedicated to Deng Makan, and he's talking about meeting someone named Duot at Twilight. And he gets this news, this bad news, and he wonders if gods pick flowers worth liking on their way to the stream.
Okay.
And he says that the mother folded the dream of the deceased into her screams.
Oh.
And then an unfinished poem about what he will miss starts to form in his heart. And then ultimately he just gives up writing and he sobs. And he asks, what good is a poem to the bereaved compared to the person living?
Right.
And the poem ends with a cricket chirping at 4. It's very subtle.
Yeah.
Maybe this was the goodbye that was never said.
Yeah.
So it's very personal, raw grief.
Yeah. Very intimate.
Very, very intimate, yeah. Poem T is dedicated to Thon Dao Minor Jock. And this poem is broken down into 5 parts. The first part describes this very intense bond. It's like brass. And it's grown into hands that are now like crushing him. And he says the addressee has become a caesura in his story.
Okay. A surreal, like a pause.
Right, a pause. And their name is like solemnly told in family lore before silence.
Okay.
The second part details how he survives without this person. Standing in the sun with a blurry shadow, pretending to watch birds and cows, the disquiet of dreary nights, longing for a dream visit.
So sad.
Yeah. Part 3 is very stark. He talks about strangling God in his heart the morning of the addressee's transcendence, and he buried him beneath the scrotum, and he's been busy scraping off the stinking stains of scriptures, and that's why he's late with the elegy.
Wow.
Part 4, he says there are no photos of them. They were too busy savoring moments.
Whoa.
I know. And then part 5, he says the sky fell when the addressee fell.
Hmm.
The world wants him to move on, wants him to wade ashore. But he asks, what has a shore ever been but the addressee's shoulders?
So
Yeah.
beautiful.
Right. So it's this very, very, yeah, deep grief and the struggle to redefine your world after you've lost someone so important.
Yeah, when your whole world was that person.
Exactly. Exactly.